When the public thinks about climate change, they often see it as an environmental issue. In the next armchair conversation, we will learn why transitioning off of fossil fuels and cutting greenhouse gas emissions is more than an environmental decision. It's a crucial national security strategy. Gueta Mezzetti is a Pentagon energy consultant specializing in energy security, technology strategy, and team building. She has brought energy technologies to market for over 30 years for the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, NASA, Congress, and many companies. Ms. Mezzetti pioneered the Department of Defense's entry into clean and secure energy, was the founding member of the Pentagon's Energy Security Executive Council, and was a senior strategic advisor for the Army. Ms. Mezzetti will be joined in conversation with General Wesley Clark. General Clark is a co-chair of Growth Energy, an organization that advocates for pro-biofuels policies. General Clark is the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander and serves as chairman and CEO of Wesley K. Clark and Associates, among many other affiliations. He has written 4 books and is a founding member of the Clinton Global Initiative. General Clark retired as a 4-star general after 38 years in the United States Army. His awards include the Presidential Medal of Freedom, Defense Distinguished Service Medal, Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and honorary knighthoods from the British and Dutch governments. In addition to all of this, he was a presidential candidate in 2004. To discuss clean energy and national security, it's my pleasure to welcome Gueta Mezzetti and General Wesley Clark. Thank you.
You want me to go first?
Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and I want to say hello to so many old friends that I've seen here from year after year, and congratulate Chip and Sally for especially their leadership in this group. Now, we're the bad news bears up here today. I'm sorry to say that. There have been so many people with good news, and there's so many good news stories. We're the bad news, but we're the incentive to make more good news. So please take it as that. Now, yesterday, if you saw Fareed Zakaria's interview with Vladimir Putin, Mr. Putin was quite complimentary to the United States. He said, we might be the remaining superpower. Well, that's very nice of Mr. Putin, but he's not letting it go unchallenged. In fact, we're at the era right now where the structure of global institutions that were established at the end of World War II and reestablished and reformed at the end of the Cold War, and that we've all become accustomed to, these global institutions are under significant challenge today. It's a consequence of many factors, but the impact of these factors is that it's going to make the cooperation we need internationally to deal with climate change more difficult, not less difficult. Let's just look at it for a second. So take the case of China, South China Sea. Now, there's a 9-dash line. Where did it come from? It came from a map in China in 1948. It doesn't go along with the law of the sea treaty. It gives China most of the South China Sea, through which 1/3 of the world's commerce flows and through which Japan and Korea get almost all of their fuel. So it's a vital energy lifeline. That South China Sea lifeline is threatened by China's building military installations on the atolls. It's gone to the World Court. The World Court's supposed to rule this month or next month. If they rule that it's illegal, then who's going to enforce that decision on China? And if nobody enforces that decision on China, what does that say about the strength of the World Court, the rule of law, and how we move forward in an increasingly interconnected world? But China's doing everything they can to prevent the World Court from ruling against it. And there's a lot of campaigning going on in the Netherlands and elsewhere. So if the World Court decides that a 9-dash line written in 1948 can take precedence over the law of the sea and international treaties and nations' right to 200 miles offshore for economic zones, well, then what kind of world are we in then? So in either case, there's no good outcome with China. Russia seized Crimea. Its little green men took it. Now, Crimea is more than just a tourist resort. If you actually look at the map, Crimea is like an arrowhead pointing out into the Black Sea and threatening Romania and Bulgaria and Turkey. So now these nations, especially Romania and Turkey, want NATO to deploy a Black Sea flotilla to check and deter Soviet adventurism, because they know that, I said Soviet, there's a straight continuity in the personnel and in the policies. It's absolutely straight line, despite the end of the Cold War. But it's Russian pressure against these governments. They don't like it. They want assistance and support. And in the north, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania realize they're under tremendous challenge. Why? Why is Russia doing this? Why is Russia claiming that NATO's threatening it, when NATO, honestly, has a great deal of difficulty doing, I know how hard it is for NATO. NATO never once in the Cold War, ever once, had a plan for an attack, even in the event of war. All we were was defense. So the idea that NATO's threatening Russia would be laughable, except for the fact of the countermeasures which Mr. Putin is proposing. Or take the case of Iran and Saudi Arabia. What's happening with Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey is a three-way struggle for dominance in the Middle East. ISIS is a geostrategic artifact of that. It would be there in some form to resist Iran, even if it wasn't led by Ba'athist generals, and even if it wasn't using terror as its primary weapon and tactic of choice. It's a function of the competition and struggle for dominance. Prime Minister Erdogan, now President Erdogan, came to power with the idea of an ethical foreign policy for Turkey. I remember when I first heard it from the foreign minister in 2011, and I turned to my friend from Lebanon who was sitting next to me, and I said, I guess you all in Beirut are building a superhighway up to Istanbul right now, aren't you? He said, too soon for a return to the Ottoman Empire. And yet, these are the pressures that are felt by nations in the region. I was recently in Bulgaria, and Prime Minister Borisov said, you Americans have allowed Mr. Erdogan to threaten us in Bulgaria. I said, how's he threatening you? He said, we have long memories of the Ottoman Empire in Bulgaria. So there are many stresses here, but the primary stress is towards Syria, because Erdogan doesn't want to be blocked out by Iran. Iran can handle Turkey because it has a Kurdish population that inside Iran that it can feed weapons to, which then generates conflict inside Turkey as well as inside Syria. And Saudi Arabia doesn't want to be isolated and be dominated by Persia. So you've got a real cockpit for conflict in there, which is, it's defying all of the conventional rules of the post-Cold War order. The lines are blurred, and Russia's in there providing weapons to everybody. I went to my Air Force friends not long ago and said, is shock and awe dead? You know what shock and awe is. You probably don't like it much, but as a military guy, I kind of liked it because it meant that you didn't have to use ground troops. Well, shock and awe is dead. With the new Russian air defense weapons, you cannot simply cruise in and outfly the missiles and blind the radars. Even with stealth, doesn't work. So we've got some real problems. The problems, NATO is struggling. You may have seen that German Foreign Minister Steinmeier came out strongly on Friday criticizing the NATO exercise program, which of course Germany approved, that puts all these troops into Poland for this big exercise this month. Bulgaria has now come out against the Black Sea flotilla, despite the fact that behind the scenes they're asking for it. So NATO consensus is always at risk. As Prime Minister Borisov told me, how can Erdogan be a loyal member of NATO when he's talking directly to Mr. Putin? So there's lots of stresses and strains in this. And of course, the European Union is being challenged by Brexit, and by generally an inability to get ahead of the challenges that are there. So with all these problems, what you have is a challenge to cohesion and resources to deal with climate change. And we really need that. So that's why I say it's bad news. Now, what are the national security impacts of climate change? You just heard up here and 2 speakers ago the discussion of Syria. That's simply a fact. 1.5 million people poured into Syrian cities in 2009, 10, and 11 because of an unusually severe, prolonged drought in the region. And that was the kindling that fed the insurrection against Bashar Assad. Refugees, emergencies, government breakdowns, terrorism, and regional conflict are the consequences. So it's a big challenge. And here at home, we have two challenges. We have the challenges of our fuel supply and our electricity supply. Both we need to work on to get ahead and lower our carbon footprint, and both are in fact national security challenges. So we're still importing 5 million barrels per day of oil net. Second biggest source of input, Saudi Arabia. Our inputs will grow by, oil imports will grow by about 900,000 barrels a day, or about 17, 18% over the next year, because U.S. oil production is dropping. So we're still dependent on imported oil. And what that means is that our armed forces, which are one of the biggest consumers of oil, they're first in line, but our allies around the world are more dependent than we are on imported oil, and we don't have any surplus to share. So in the electric power area, of course, we're still belching out carbon dioxide from our grid system. And even though renewables are growing topsy-turvy, we've got some issues with that. Some of the good news here is that we are moving now, finally, to commercialize cellulosic ethanol. If we can just keep the renewable fuel standard in place, we're fighting the oil industry, we're fighting the Grocery Marketers Association, we're fighting everybody who wants a subsidy other than the people who are interested in climate change on this renewable fuel standard. By 2022, we're supposed to have 36 billion gallons of renewable fuel in the nation's fuel supply. Right now, we've got less than 15 billion gallons, but we can now see daylight at the end of the tunnel. 2008 knocked cellulosic biofuel off track, but we've got two firms now that are really moving ahead with it. I'm affiliated with one of these firms, a Poet, and we do have a 25 million gallon per year plant. It is commercial, it is in operation. We've actually figured out how to take corn stalks, chop them, grind them, pulverize them, steam them, take the cellulose, convert it to starch, take the starch, convert it to a sugar, take the sugar, ferment it into alcohol, and actually make a fuel at a reasonably cost-effective price, and it's getting cheaper every month. So we can see our way clear to meet the goal of the renewable fuel standard, provided we don't gut it. For electric power, it's amazing what the technology people have done with wind and solar. And really, there's no end in sight to this. If we can protect our price structure from those who want to roll back net metering, and if we can protect our grid from cybersecurity standpoint. This I want to turn over to Gueta and ask you to talk about the specific national security implications of this, Greta.
Hi, everybody. I usually don't speak to public audiences. I usually speak to classified audiences, and so you pardon me if I have to watch my words a little bit. The electric grid problem is a national security problem for the United States, but it's also a problem worldwide. In the Middle East, the dependencies on a very clothesline structured grid around the coast and the implications for exporting fuel to the Western Pacific are very bad. But in the United States, I've been working on this since September 11th, when the Joint Staff kind of handed me energy and said, go with it, because at the time it was considered the soft stuff. The threat wasn't so bad then. Since World War II, and probably before, we have been blowing up infrastructures. We did that to the Germans. The military is particularly good at that. They set up a defensive posture office after World War II. And we have been looking at the vulnerabilities since then out of the Navy, and I'm kind of focused on the Navy these days, in a manner that has preceded the threat as it's been rising in the last, I'd say, 8 years. So that, and Wes wanted me to talk about the threat a little bit. These threats, and there is cyber, there's physical, there's a hybrid, which is that you sabotage a control system that's stuck in a substation with a kill switch that can be remotely activated, and so that's a hybrid physical cyber. So you see right away the cyber and the physical, the lines are blurred in terms of what you do. There's electromagnetic pulse, which is coming up now with some people thinking that the Koreans have 2 nuclear satellites already, and that's not verified. There's geomagnetic storms, which NOAA and the military are quite concerned about, and FERC as well. So there's a series of things. We've been trying to do things in the military for climate purposes and to protect military assets that are dependent on the grid for functionality, and the defense industrial base, which is dependent on the grid for functionality, and the large refineries, which are dependent on the grid for functionality. The truth is that of that subset, possibly the defense industrial base doesn't fit there, but with the military assets and the refineries, you can't run those things on diesel gensets for very long. Either you don't have the infrastructure to have the backup for 2 weeks, maybe 3 days. The outage periods for the large transformers are about 6 months to 2 years. It's like moving the space shuttle. The military has considered that so seriously that they have offered in concept to store the spares that aren't made yet by industry for the 500 and the 765 kV transformers on bases and move them. They don't fit under freeway overpasses, they are top heavy and fall over. It takes special railway cars. They have to be custom made, they have to be tended to. It would be a mess. And if you are considering the chaos, because we assume, some of us assume, that a real attack on the grid, and I'll talk about that in a minute, would be coupled with a secondary attack. This is what they do in the Middle East, in Belize, and the cartels do it in Mexico. They take down the grid, they move in and take over the town, and then they restore power to the people who are their friends, and they deprive power to the people who don't agree with them. Many of you may remember a movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger called Total Recall. How many people remember that movie? Hands? They turn the air on and off on Mars. They controlled the air to control the dissidents. In the Middle East, the Iranians are exporting power from one end all the way around to Oman, okay? The grid hugs the coastline. There's a lot of single point failures. This thing with the Saudis and the ability of the Saudis to export power in the other direction and disconnect that from the oil system is really important, because if the grid goes down in the Middle East and the Iranians just decide they want to turn it off at some point, right? But remember, these are 30, 50, 100-year investments that we make in our power systems and in our grid. If they decide at some point they want to turn that off, which they're probably perfectly capable of doing, you know, it'll cause chaos. There's a desalination plant on the border between Kuwait and Saudi Arabia that keeps the peace between the Sunnis and the Shiites. They have no water storage. If that goes down, there's no water. You can imagine the kind of regional conflict that would cause. And so these things can be done not just by the Iranians, but a lot of others. Let me give you some examples that you shouldn't see in the front pages of the Washington Post, and you shouldn't post this online. I was told by a former CIA director that there were plans to take down the US grid that were found in Osama bin Laden's caves. In 2004, when we first started looking at this at the Defense Science Board, it was the Bolivians, the Brazilians, and the Italians that were getting attacked because of extortion. We saw this cyber probing going on, really kind of like, what is it? Can we figure out what we would do if we wanted to? And then we've seen that escalate since this mess in the Middle East. There have been things that I can't talk about that have been turned off in the United States. It was about 2009 when 2 life rafts came up the Shenandoah River to a major interconnect in Western Virginia in the middle of the night. that provides the power to Washington, D.C., and all those things on the East Coast. And there just happen to be maintenance workers out on the site. These guys got out of the water with full scuba gear and went up to take it apart. Were chased away. I'm sure you've heard about the Metcalf substation in California several times. Some people think that was a setup to try to make people understand that this is a problem. The vulnerabilities are all over the place. The attacks are all over the place. In October 2015, ISIS publicly announced that it was making plans to take down the U.S. electric grid. I could go on. It's all over the place. I can't talk about Ukraine. Maybe you can talk about Ukraine. My two technical expert buddies were sent to Ukraine. We don't have that many people that understand how the grid works. They've been over there. I haven't been able to talk to them. It's been so bad. So we have a shortage of people that understand this from an offensive posture, no, but from a defensive posture, yes. And that needs to be attended to. And by the way, that would be very good for the renewable energy industry in the new administration. We need a curricula of power engineers that understand how to get renewable energy on the grid and also what the vulnerabilities are and how to protect it. This is a place where national security and the renewable energy industry for climate purposes can come together, because we've talked about this, but until you do the engineering studies that are going to get this power on the grid and secure the grid, it's all talk. And it really is all talk. This is part of the problem in Washington. The civilian bureaucratic leadership is engaged in this horrible voluntary effort with the utility industry. Remember, the utility industry owns the grid. Florida Power and Life owns, hi Amory, Amory wrote the original book, Brittle Power. You should read that book. It's fabulous. There he is. They own the grid. We spent tens of millions of dollars to solve one early problem on cyber and substations. We built something. We had it tested by the DOE labs. We built 100 of them. We offered them in the industry. They refused to put them on their substations, right? We don't want to do it. We own them. Go away. It took 7 years for the Department of Homeland Security to figure out how do we give clearances to the utility industry so that they could deputize some people to explain what the present threat. It did not used to be a clear and present danger. It is almost, and in my world, it is a very clear and present danger now. So what do we do? Where can we come together? What can we do about it? There's several solutions. We need these backup transformers. They have to be pre-positioned. They have to be pre-manufactured, because the manufacturing industry that builds these things runs on the grid. So the component parts and the component manufacturing, where they put them together to make a whole, if the grid's not up and running, you can't build them, okay? Because they're like the space shuttle, they need to be pre-positioned. Islanding power, renewable power, so that you're not connected to the grid. For our top assets, continuity of government operations, NORAD, NORTHCOM, Defense Department assets, some of this is going on. The last mile, there's a bill that's just been introduced by the Senate Intelligence, Democratic and Republican senators, to take the last mile of transmission and industrial control systems to analog that lead to some of these important assets. Why is the military important? Again, because this attack will be coupled with a secondary attack. Again, another reason, the military has electricity use assets and bases in 49 states. If you protect those high priority things first, everybody's going to get taken care of. Right now, it's a total mishmash where they're not prioritizing. The civilian agencies are not prioritizing anything. So what can we do in the next administration? There's a long list that I don't have time to talk about. I'd like to get a list to people. But Hillary Clinton, if she's elected, will be spending money on putting renewable energy on federal lands. Military lands are federal lands. My concept for you to consider, and I think there's a confluence of interest, and we can get the Republicans this way because they're worried about national security. And I'm trying to be very practical about this rather than getting everybody to admit that there's a climate problem and we're responsible. Let's just get to the solutions, get them funded the fastest, quickest way we can, okay? Because we're out of time with all of these threats. So my idea, one of my ideas, is to take these federal lands, don't let the renewable energy be put on something that's going to go down, a grid that's going to go down. Let's get a new grid. Let's harden it. Physical, cyber, you know, the physical protections are just easy, right? Physical, cyber, industrial control systems, as much as we can. There's a lot of ideas around. Let's create safe havens where we can export power out and make the old grid passé. Let's just show them that we're modern, kind of like a Silicon Valley for, you know, renewable energy on federal lands. This also needs to be done in Europe, in the Western Pacific, to the extent we have friends in the Middle East, probably there, in all nations. It's a worldwide problem. At least in the United States, we have a dysfunctional construct for trying to deal with this, with opportunities coming up in the new administration. Internationally, there's no construct to deal with this. That's my wrap.
Okay, we warned you. It was not good news.
But there's
Okay?
opportunities.
There are active daily challenges to the electricity grid in the United States. There are those who say that the logic bombs have already been implanted that could be activated by a hostile overseas power. There are some people who believe this is like nuclear weapons and you could have mutually assured destruction, but who knows? So we got time for a question or two? 5 minutes for questions, discussion. Right up here.
So I'm Harry Cloran with XPRIZE at Singularity University, but I also have a software company that's in discussions with InQtel and other places on the very fact that almost every government computer system and file system, and also the whole grid, is so archaic. I mean, it's a 11-year-old child anywhere on the planet could hack into it. But what happens is you run into, you start the process and then you hit somebody who is totally ignorant and then it just falls down. What can innovators like us at XPRIZE or as an entrepreneur do to get across that barrier and deliver the security that's needed? Because it actually already exists. The security exists in the world that I live in, but getting it into those resources is nearly impossible.
The assumption that the security exists, we have to go with things like that because there's too much to do. But remember, and the president finally said this the other day, we've been talking about the Pentagon since September 11th. The terrorists only have to get it right once. We have to get it right 100% of the time. So you assume, you know, just like if one thing does, they're going to keep working on it. We'll put a workaround in, they'll get around it. So, you know, I think the cyber, the industrial control systems are important. You know, I think going off the grid, regionalizing, being able to separate is more important.
The basic thing is people have to understand the threat, at least notionally, and then you have to understand that anything that can be done with software can be undone with software. And the last line of defense is a group of cyber warriors who are on your net chasing the intruders out and trying to check it out. And that's going on today in many locations. It's just that the American public doesn't know it, just like we weren't as sensitive to airline security before 9/11 as we are right now. So most of our SCADA systems on renewables are not really protected. If you've ever seen a wind turbine blow up, they do, and they can be forced to blow up, and somebody can get in that SCADA system. So free energy, it isn't free. Got to protect it.
We can figure out how to pay. There are creative ways to pay for these improvements, and we should talk about that at some point.
Other comments, questions?
Yeah. Thank you both very much. I'm Mike Hart with Sierra Energy. And one of the problems that we faced, we have a technology that takes garbage and turns it to clean energy. And we've developed it with the Army and down in Monterey, California. And the idea is that you could create 24/7 power, reliable power, enough to actually power a whole facility and beyond. And it's carbon negative. and that is for every ton of garbage you put in, you're knocking 3.5 tons of greenhouse gas out of the air. But the problem is that the Army embraced the idea. PG&E has made it miserable for us to interconnect. We can island just fine, but PG&E has pushed back very hard. We've managed to get our agreements in place enough so we can run. But trying to connect to the grid on all the military bases, and also from a federal perspective, as far as the renewable energy on federal lands, their solicitations always say, gee, it must be renewable, therefore it has to be solar or wind. There's nothing in there about 24/7 baseload energy.
That'll change next year,
I hope so.
think. The military services are, I mean, they're just beginning to do this in earnest. Each one has kind of a stovepipe thing going on. We were talking earlier, if you take Nevada, there's an Army, an Air Force, and a Navy base. They're all in the same grid. They should be working together. We need a lot of changes.
But we do have problems with exactly what you're saying. That's the fight with the power companies, including TVA, who want to control all energy production. So to try to get a power purchase agreement, to try to secure it, to try to separate it from the big power companies, that's a tough business because nobody wants to lose their market share. No matter how big they are, they're not prepared to say, okay, well, we don't need that market. They all get paid on scale, and so they like that scale. So these are some of the challenges we're facing. I guess we got one more question
I'd
here.
like to ask Avery, please say whatever you like.
Thanks, Gueta. Thanks, Wes. And thank you both for your wonderful work on this issue. Actually, in about 14 states, they're not all rewarded on volume, so we're starting to fix that. But you're right, they viscerally dislike competition. And we've just analyzed 6 anti-solar tariffs of various flavors, all of which turned out to be well-aimed boomerangs that would actually speed and expand solar adoption, not quite what they had in mind. I've just taken up with some of the industry leadership exactly the issue you mentioned, that many traditional utility rules from the knife switch pre-power electronics days prohibit resilient hookups. Even though we have a painfully arrived at over more than a decade industry consensus standard, IEEE 1547, which lets you hook up resiliently in a way that's safe for the lineman and still lets you run without the grid. My own house works this way. And it ought to be the default design. So any of you that have influence over utilities or utilities commissions, I would urge you to say there is a big win here for national and community and family security by just changing the rules to allow this safe procedure to be used in your utility service territory by anybody who wants to install that way. There's, you know, it's no loss to anybody that they weren't going to lose anyway economically, but it's a huge gain for security, and we just all ought to get at it at our state and grassroots level.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to give you the bad news.
Sorry.